Chapter 28, Collision Courses Abroad and at Home, 1946 to 1960. So basically in this chapter we're looking at the post-war era, and we'll look at the economy, we'll look at the fear of communism that broke out as a result of what was going on in the Soviet Union and how they successfully took much of Eastern Europe, how the outbreak of the Cold War began and what that looked like for the United States, and then we'll go all the way to the election of 1960. The post-war economy. So even though there were a lot of economists who feared that the end of World War II would bring back a state of depression for the United States and the world, this did not happen. There was a pent-up demand for houses, cars, and other consumer goods. And so this actually spurred production. The war had kind of put a hold on people buying houses and cars and things like that. And so when it was over, there was this, again, like a pent-up consumer demand for those goods. And so production continued. Another good thing that came out of the post-war economy was the GI Bill of Rights in 1944, and this allowed veterans to pursue an education, learn a trade, or start a business. But this has been considered one of the most significant pieces of legislation produced by the federal government in regard to Veterans Affairs, and it was definitely one that impacted the United States socially, economically, and politically. And basically the way this worked was that they gave like a $20 weekly allowance to unemployed veterans. And this bill almost did not come to pass. There were many people in Congress who feared that veterans wouldn't have any incentive to work if you just gave them $20 a week. However, it did pass, and it helped veterans out a lot. So after the death of President Roosevelt, Harry Truman became president, and he attempted to follow Roosevelt's policies at home and abroad. How he did on that was another matter. He really wasn't that good with people. So rather than like convincing or appeasing his opponents, he oftentimes just hurled insults at them. And if there was any complication that arose, it often confused him and he couldn't think clearly, so he would just dig in his heels and sort of strike out blindly. On top of that, inflation and labor unrest helped the Republicans win control of Congress in 1946. And then a year later, Congress passed the Taft-Hartley Act. And this had actually been vetoed by Truman, and they passed it over his veto. But the Taft-Hartley Act restricted the rights of labor unions and allowed the president to order an 80-day cooling period for any strike that affected the nation. So while the act made it more difficult to organize industries, it didn't really hamper existing unions. So what is the containment policy? So we have, at this point in time, we've got Stalin, who seems intent on expanding Soviet power and thus communism into Central Europe and Asia and the Middle East. Who knows at this point what he has planned, just that he wants to expand communism. So by January 1946, Truman began to move toward a tougher stance with respect to the Soviet Union. And this policy originated with a guy named George Kennan, and he was a Foreign Service officer. And basically he said that the origins of Soviet expansionism lay in the instability and illegitimacy of the Soviet regime. And so he proposed that the United States very firmly but patiently resist Soviet expansion wherever it appeared, or basically contain communism or containment. The problem was he never really elaborated on how the Soviet Union should be contained or in what parts of the world that policy should be applied to, or what lengths the United States should go to in order to contain communism. But Truman adopted this as his policy toward the spread of Soviet communism. The atom bomb and the continuing controversy. So, of course, Truman had authorized the use of this bomb to force the Japanese to surrender. And he had also hoped that it would almost serve as a counterweight or a measure of intimidation to the numerically superior Red Army in the Soviet Union. But Stalin really refused to be intimidated, even by the atomic bomb. Americans were still left uneasy. There were horrifying accounts of the devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The stories began to come to light, the pictures, the images, the videos of the devastation. And so there was lots of controversy surrounding the use of the atomic bomb and should it be used in the future. So Truman came to doubt that the American people would ever allow him or anyone to use the atomic bomb or atomic weapons for aggressive purposes again. So in November 1945, the United States proposed that the United Nations supervise all nuclear energy production. And so the UN created an Atomic Energy Commission, which put forward a plan to eventually outlaw atomic weapons that would be backed by unrestricted UN inspections. Of course, the Soviets rejected the Americans and the UN plans, but nevertheless, the commission went forward anyway. They actually lasted until the 1960s, when there were an increasing number of critics who said that the Atomic Energy Commission's regulations were too rigorous in several important areas, like radiation protection standards, nuclear reactor safety, plant siting, environmental protection, all of that. So eventually, this commission was dissolved in the 70s. So turning point in Greece. So in 1947, Truman's policy of containment began to take shape. The first communist threat arose in Greece, and Truman asked Congress for economic and military aid for Greece and Turkey. And so the Truman Doctrine sort of came into being. It promised that, quote, it would support free peoples resisting subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. And so Truman sold this proposal, and the issue would actually come up again in Czechoslovakia, where the United States would intervene on behalf of those facing communist threats. So unfortunately for many of the European countries, their economies were unstable after the war. We talked about the fact that in the United States, our economy did well, but there was still lots to be rebuilt in Europe. And so in 1947, Secretary of State George Marshall proposed a plan, which was called the Marshall Plan. And in this plan, the United States would basically finance the reconstruction of the European economy. This was a big undertaking, some skeptics there, but it actually worked. After the fall of Czechoslovakia in a communist coup in February of 1948, Congress appropriated over $13 billion for the European recovery effort. And again, the results were spectacular. By 1951, just 3 years later, the economies of Western Europe were booming as a result of the Marshall Plan. And so Western European nations moved toward social, cultural, and economic collaboration. And the question of Germany, Germany had been divided into zones of occupation, and this was done in part by Britain, France, and the United States. And so in the West, they created a West German Republic from their zones of occupation. And West Germany thrived. The Soviets, of course, had control of the East, and so they were now communist. And when the Soviets closed ground access to Berlin, the United States responded with an airlift that forced the Soviets to lift the blockade. But this was really only the beginning in regards to fighting between the United States and the USSR even. So by the spring of 1948, public opinion polls showed that most Americans thought Truman was completely incompetent. He had pretty much alienated both conservatives and liberals in the North, but somehow still managed to win the Democratic nomination. There was actually an instance in the party nomination, or in the convention, where some of the Democrats walked out because the convention adopted a strong civil rights stance, and they chose Strom Thurmond to run on a third-party ticket. And to make matters worse, the left wing also defected, and Henry Wallace ran on the progressive ticket. So you've got Democrat Harry Truman and Republican, the Republican nominee, who was Governor Thomas Dewey of New York. And Dewey thought, because Truman was so hated, that he would just have an easy victory. So he ran a listless campaign. He really didn't even try very hard. Truman, on the other hand, did launch a vigorous campaign. He really wanted to win. And most of it was him attacking and denouncing the, quote, do-nothing Republican Congress. And he emphasized, of course, the success of his Berlin airlift, and that helped his re-election bid. On the other side, Henry Wallace, people thought that he was too pro-Soviet. And so many people voted for Truman just because they thought Wallace was too pro-Soviet. And he surprised everyone and won a narrow victory, Truman that is, in the popular vote, and a more substantial victory in the Electoral College. And so after this election, Truman put forward a bunch of proposals which he called the Fair Deal. And the Fair Deal was pretty much just a continuation of the liberal New Deal. However, very little of his program was actually put into law. So during Truman's second term, he actually got a chance to try to contain communism abroad. And the confrontation between the United States and the USSR, or the Soviet Union, was increasingly dominating international attention. And so NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was formed, and really it was designed to protect the West from Soviet aggression. And it was formed in 1949. The Soviets in the same year figured out how to create an atomic bomb. They detonated their own atomic bomb in September of that year, and so Truman then authorized the development of a hydrogen bomb. So meanwhile, containment is failing in Asia. In China, you have Mao Zedong and his communists defeating the nationalists there. Chiang Kai-shek, representing the nationalists, flees in disarray to Formosa in 1949. And right-wing Republicans come out against Truman and say that you didn't support China. You didn't support the nationalists strong enough. And therefore, they believe that Truman, quote, lost China. And so Truman ordered a review of containment. And the resulting report, which was called NSC 68, called for a massive expansion of the nation's armed forces in order to deal with the problem of communism abroad. And so Truman initially had reservations about this document, but the events that unfolded in Korea changed his mind. So American policymakers had decided that a land war in Asia would be entirely unworkable, if not altogether impossible. But when communist North Korea invaded South Korea in June of 1950, Truman actually did decide on a military response. And so Korea at this point is divided at the 38th north latitude into the Democratic People's Republic in the north, which of course was backed by the Soviet Union, and the Republic of Korea in the south, which was backed by the United States and the United Nations. And despite early gains by the North, UN forces, who were 90% American, by the way, under the command of Douglas MacArthur, eventually turned the tide and began pressing north. MacArthur proposed that they not only defend South Korea, but also go on and conquer North Korea as well. And despite opposition from his advisors, Truman went ahead and said, okay, you can advance as far as the Chinese border. In November, though, of 1950, 33 divisions of the People's Republic of China Army crossed the Yalu River, and this is at the border of North Korea and China, and pretty much shattered UN lines there. And so MacArthur then urged the bombing of Chinese installations north of that river and a blockade of China. And Truman said, no, enough is enough. He rejected MacArthur's proposals, and MacArthur openly criticized Truman, his administration, and the whole containment policy because he didn't believe it went far enough. And so Truman actually removed Douglas MacArthur, a 5-star general, from command. So in June of 1951, the communists finally agreed to negotiations, which they did drag on for a while. But initially, this type of police action, as it was called, was popular with the American public. The idea that we could go in and stop a communist threat or save a nation that was experiencing a communist threat seemed heroic. But as the bloody stalemate sort of went on, and especially as Vietnam came and went, it really eroded public enthusiasm for this kind of thing. The communist issue at home. So the Korean War really illustrated the paradox that even at the height of its power, American influence was waning. Yes, we technically won this war, but it dragged on, and people were frustrated by the end of it. And so the United States was facing this internal pressure with the question of communism, as well as external threats. There was the exposure of some communist espionage in Canada and Great Britain, and so Americans were terrified of communist subversion. And people even accused Truman of being soft on communism. So in order to counteract that, he established the Loyalty Review Board in 1947, and the purpose of it was just to ensure that there were no subversives or no one who was communist found employed by the federal government. And this was heightened even further by the Rosenberg trials. This was a court case involving Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, and this was an American couple who they were spies for the Soviet Union, and they were caught and executed in 1953. And so this really gave rise to our next bullet point here, McCarthyism. So Joseph McCarthy, this was an obscure senator from Wisconsin, and in February of 1950, he said that the State Department was, quote, infested with communists. And he offered no evidence to support this. But because his claims were outlandish, people believed him. The lie was too great to not be believed. And so, again, the enormity of these charges and the status of his targets, they were all like celebrities or senators or people employed by the government, convinced people that there had to be some truth in his accusations. And with the events of the Cold War unfolding and the public's resulting fears, people were susceptible to these allegations. So, in the election of 1952, the Republicans chose Dwight D. Eisenhower, champion war hero of World War II. And he was a tolerant guy, and it made him a welcome change from Truman. He was an able leader. He had demonstrated that by his military career, and his campaign promise was to go to Korea. And this was a political masterstroke, really. And so he easily defeated his Democratic opponent, Adlai Stevenson of Illinois. And Eisenhower really didn't do anything with the New Deal programs. He just left them as they were. He did undertake some very modest but new initiatives. He spoke out against creeping socialism. He called for more local control of government affairs. He said he would reduce federal spending, he would balance the budget, cut taxes, that type of thing. There were some issues he did adopt the Keynesian approach. In other words, spend money we don't have to promote economic growth, and that money will come back to us later. He did prove to be a first-rate politician, though. He knew how to be flexible without compromising his basic values. And so he had these great political skills, was hoping to maybe make the Republican Party a little more moderate in his own image, but he was unable to do that. So we'll pick up tomorrow with the Eisenhower-Dulles foreign policy and the self-destruction of Joseph McCarthy.